And hello again. This is attempt number 2. And can you hear me now? Okay, so hopefully the audio is working this time. That's kind of an important point, and it looks like it is working for me. And yep, looks like we are good. So this is, let me just get reoriented here. This is episode 4 of Steve Relearning Git. And in prior episodes, let me just advance a slide here. I have mentioned that kind of one of the reasons I'm not terribly comfortable with Git is because I've only used it primarily through Visual Studio. So I've used the Visual Studio interface to manage files, to manage check-ins, commits, branching, everything. And I just relied on a few buttons and features there and had never really looked at what Git was doing or what Visual Studio was doing behind the scenes to trigger those Git events. So between that limitation of what's available in the UI and not understanding the commands behind the scenes, one of the challenges I think I have is not understanding how to fix problems. So I don't know exactly what Git is doing, therefore I don't know the actual Git commands being issued, and therefore I don't know how to undo things and fix problems when they occur, or understand really what's going on when a problem happens. So I want to explore the actual Git commands at the command line, to just learn them, understand them, not to be an expert, but to just get familiar with them and reduce that barrier of intimidation that can sometimes occur when you're working with Git. So with that, let me just make sure everything is still working here. We are good. Okay, so let me figure out what, so understanding what now that I'm working with AL and Business Central and VS Code, my goals are to understand what the VS Code UI is doing when I click a button or stage or commit or something like that. Second is learning the actual Git commands that are being issued and being able to issue those myself if I wanted to via the command line. And as I mentioned, being able to ultimately fix some mistakes or roll things back if I needed to, if I make a mistake with Git, which is not uncommon actually, and make Git less intimidating. And then I don't intend to use Git via command line with VS Code. It looks like the VS Code UI is actually pretty good and makes it really easy to do certain things that would be difficult or challenging to do manually via command line. You can undo things much easier in VS Code, it looks like, than if you had to type out the commands. So I don't intend to use it regularly, but I just want to get over some of these learning hurdles and get more comfortable with Git. So that's the background. Okay, so with that, at the 5-minute mark, let's break some stuff. So Studio 4. Okay. So here we are on my Docker container server machine, and I'm going to start by launching VS Code. So before we start all of this, let me just make sure my streaming software is set up properly here. Okay, just needed to back that up a little bit. Okay, so here I have VS Code, and oh, come on. How do I... There we go. So VS Code with nothing open, no workspace or anything. So let's start a new workspace by pressing F1, choosing ALGO, and I'm going to call this project Git Command Line. Press Enter, choose my platform, and this is my server. And this is just to get something semi-realistic set up. If you already have a project, you can be ready to go. Okay, so now I have a few files. I have VS Code settings, launch.json, app.json, hello world, etc. So that's all good. Let me just scoot this down. So now that I have this file, I want to jump right into the Git command lines. And to do that, I'm going to click on the terminal menu at the top of VS Code and choose New Terminal. Okay, so good, it happened. Notice that this pane at the bottom is there. It switches to terminal here, but it's blank. What is going on here? This appears to be a bug, more or less, in Visual Studio Code. Who knows what's actually causing it? It may be something else that is preventing VS Code from displaying the terminal properly. But the end result is you will see nothing here in the terminal pane when you try to open a new terminal window. Now you'll notice there's a slider bar right there that I can slide up. Okay, I can slide up. Now if I do that, I will see Windows PowerShell. And so Windows PowerShell title is here, but there's no command prompt. So then I hit enter, and there's a command prompt, but no cursor. I hit enter again. Now my cursor appears. So if you try to open the terminal, you may notice that nothing happens. And it does this. I have this problem here on my server. I do not have the problem on my Windows 10 laptop. So it's random by machine. And I asked on Twitter, and one person said, yep, I've seen this on one machine, but not another. Another person says, yep, I've seen this issue. And it's been going on for years. It's nothing new. And all the posts I saw relating to this issue, it's been going on since 2019 at least. Everyone has tried everything, no resolution. Uninstall, reinstall, whatever. So I would say don't even try to fight it. When you, let's just close this, when you open up a new terminal. Now the second time you open, when VS Code has been opened, the second time you open a terminal, it'll work. But if you close VS Code, open a new VS Code, and go to terminal, new terminal, it will be blank. And that's fine. Just deal with it. It's not worth the hassle. So just hit enter a couple of times and you'll get a prompt. Okay. So now that we have a prompt here, let me see if I can make this bigger. Okay. So there we go. So here we are at the command prompt. So we created a project, a new AL project, and so we have some files here. But let's see. Oh, no folder open. Oh, I closed and reopened. Okay, so let me open my folder that I just created. Let's see. Let's hope it asks me to save it. Yep, Git command line. Going to reopen that workspace. Okay. And let me just download symbols while I'm at it. Okay, sorry, the bug thing kind of was a distraction. So now I have my files, my workspace, and I'm going to go to terminal, new terminal, and look at that. It's because I had VS Code open the second time this works. Okay, so now we are at the Git command line project folder, workspace folder. I'm going to CLS and I'm going to close this. Now, our new project is brand new, so I'm going to try to do as much as I can via command line. It does not have a local Git repo. It does not have a remote Git repo, so we're kind of starting from scratch. So what's the first thing we're going to do? And let me see if my fancy schmancy new feature works. Look at that. We are going to do a git init, like git initialize. And this is equivalent to, if you go over to the source control button over here, this will say initialize repository. You can click this button, it does it for you, pretty straightforward. But we're learning the command line, so let's do git init. I'm just going to close this, and I'm going to type git init, enter. It says, great, initialized empty git repository in this command, or in this directory and .git folder. Awesome. So that was easy. So now if I click on my source control button in VS Code, you'll notice I now have this project set up. It no longer says initialize repository. So we have a local repository. Git has detected all of these files as new, and it's saying, hey, I'm going to consider all of these as changes. Cool. Okay. So now what if I said, oh, great, I've done some work here. I'm ready to stage these files. What you can do is type, let's see, look at that, git add star. Now this is one variant that says take all of the files that I have that are changed and stage them all. So normally you can click on this plus sign in VS Code, or let's see if there's a command, commit all, changes. Okay, so you go into changes and stage all. So that's the equivalent menu in VS Code, but you can also just click plus, 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 plus. But if you're doing them all, you can do changes, stage all changes. So let's give that a try. Git add star. And it gives me a message saying it's replacing LF with CRLF. I'm assuming that's just the initial files that are written by the template, the AL template. But you'll notice something happened over here on the left. All the files used to be listed in changes. Now, all of the files are listed under staged changes. Cool. Pretty neat. So with one command line, we just pushed all our files to be staged. Excellent. Okay. Now, what if I say, I didn't mean to do that. I forgot to set up my gitignore file first. So we can do what is called a git reset. And this is one way where you say, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's pull all of my files out of the stage changes. So I'm going to type git reset, enter. And you'll notice something happen on the left here. All of my files went from staged, and just stage disappeared. They all went back to changes. So that's kind of a handy thing. If you remember, it's like, oops, I forgot something. Let me go fix that first before I stage and commit. And I don't know all the scenarios that would be. In this case, good example, I forgot to set up my gitignore. So I don't want all these changes to be staged. So let's just do a quick test. I'm going to press Control F5 and let me screencast mode so you see hopefully my shortcuts. Control F5. So I'm going to pretend, where's my output? Okay, Control F5. There we go. Okay, so I've essentially published, and the reason I did that is so that I could, not so I could open this, so that I could get an app file in here. So let's pretend that for the purpose of this exercise, I do not want my app files to be included in Git at this stage of the development process. Okay, so you'll notice here that the app file shows up as a changed file, and maybe we don't want that. So we want to gitignore. So how do we do that? So let's create a gitignore. Now, normally you could just go in here, right click, but since we're using the terminal, let's just go all in and use the terminal. So I'm going to switch back to my terminal. Let me just clear this out. And there are a couple ways to create a gitignore file from the terminal. So I could do all of these quickly in sequence via the terminal. One is to use the code command. So you could say code.gitignore and press enter. So I'll show that to you. I'm not a fan of this, and I'll show you why. So as soon as I press this, press enter here, it does create a gitignore file for me. So let's go in here, let's go into my git command line, and I haven't saved it yet. So it creates this as a new tab. Now let me go in here and say test. Well, it's a gitignore, so let me just save it. So now I have this file called gitignore. Okay, that's fine, but you'll notice something here. It opened it in a new VS Code window, and I looked into whether it's possible to have it open in my current VS Code window, and supposedly there is. It's like a -R reuse window, a reuse session, but it didn't work for me. I couldn't get it to work and open in my main VS Code window. It always popped open this new window. So I'm not a fan of this method. So I'm going to just delete this file, and I'm going to use a different method that I found, and that's just to use PowerShell. We're in a PowerShell terminal here. So there we go. Weird. So I'm going to use a PowerShell command that I found called new item, and I'm going to type my file name, gitignore. So when I press enter, it just creates the file for me right in this session, right in this terminal. I didn't leave no new VS Code window. And you'll notice my gitignore file is there. So now I can just go over to Files, click on gitignore, and I can say, well, I want to pretend I want to exclude my app files at this stage of development. I'm going to click on Save. Now, if I go back to source control, you'll notice that my gitignore is working and my app file is not listed in the upper left there. So that's how we would create our gitignore file, and we'd exclude a file from it. Okay, so I'm going to close that now. And let's see. Let's say that I am developing and I create a new file. So I'm just going to use the standard method of creating a new AL file. So I'm going to call this filename.al. Okay, and this is my new file, filename.al. And I'm going to save that file. Great. So now I have a change. I'm going over to my source control page here, or tab, and you'll notice that I have filename.al listed as a change. Very cool. So what if I'm ready to, check this in, stage it, and commit it? How do I do that via command line? So I'm going to say git up. There we go. I'll keep forgetting to do this, I'm sure. Git add filename.al. Git add, and I'm going to type filename.al. And when I press enter, what's going on? Why didn't it complain? Let's try that again. Okay, let me just close all these terminal windows. Terminal, new terminal. And I'm going to jump ahead. Filename.al, untracked files. Okay, so I would like to stage filename.al. Let's try that again. Git add filename.al. It should be giving me an error, saying that that file cannot be found. Not sure why it's not. It did in my testing. So let's just try the proper file name. So my point is that it's case sensitive. So git add filename.al lowercase. And there it goes. You'll notice stage changes shows up here. Now let's see, it's not under problems, not under output, not under debug console. Very strange. Okay, not sure what's going on there. Now, git add filename.al, that staged my file. So rather than clicking on the plus sign, that's one way to selectively stage one file. Well, if this is a brand new project or I have 10 changes, then what if I want to just stage all of these? I can just type git add star, which says, okay, great, I've staged all your changes. And let me just make sure that I didn't skip a step. Oh, I have. Nope. Okay, Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So I've staged all my changes now. So what if I say, well, I just want to double check on what changes I made. I already showed it earlier. I can click on a file and say, am I sure that this is what I want to do? And you can do this pre-staging in changes, and then after it's staged, you can click on this. So let's just back that out and give that a try. So I'm going to do a git reset. I'm going to unstage all my changes. There's my file name. And you can do a diff in this window here. So this I found is kind of the nicest way to view those changes. Okay, so let's just re-add them. Git add star. And there we have everything staged. Now you can also right-click on here and open changes, but looks like just clicking on the file has the same effect. Okay, now what if I staged all of these files? And rather than, what if I want to just unstage one of them and fix something? Rather than doing git reset, pulling them all out of staging, I just want to remove one. And this command I'm kind of iffy on. You can do a git rm, git remove, cached, and this is a very important parameter to add, --cached, filename.al, and you'll notice that pulls filename.al out of staged and back into changes. And so you say, okay, well, now that I have this back out, I want to say, this is a new change, and I'm going to save that. And that way I can make the change that I want and I can restage it. So git add filename.al, and there we go, it's restaged. Now the problem I have with git rm is that if you forget the --cached, depending on where your files are at, what stage it is in, it will actually remove the entire file from Git and essentially delete it. And you can recover from this, but it's a little tricky and takes multiple steps. So I would be careful with the git rm command in general. You'll want to use that sparingly and probably go to the UI here if you want to unstage the change. So while you can learn something and do some powerful stuff at the command line, you can also make some very painful mistakes, I think. Okay, so let me see if I can follow along here. Okay, so how do I figure out what's going on? You can see it in VS Code, which is kind of nice. How do you do that in command line? Let's hide that. And let me say git status. So if I type git status, it kind of shows me essentially what I'm seeing in the source control pane. I see that no commits yet, changes to be committed. So these are staged changes that I've added using git add. And it says new file, and it lists my new files. And because I have a gitignore, it is excluding my .app file. Okay, so that is my git status. And that was not viewing changes. What do I got next here? Okay, we did a git rm cached already. I'm just catching up, as I thought I would forget about changing my titles. And then we just did a git status. Nice recap here. And what do we have next here? Okay, so now that we've got our git status, let's commit. So we have stage changes. We are ready to commit. So how do we do that? Okay. So sorry, the chat takes a minute to come through to me. So Waldo says code.gitignore-a will open it in the same VS Code session. Very cool. Let's give that a try. So let me unstage my gitignore. And how do I do that? Well, let me use the semi-dangerous git rm --cached.gitignore. Okay, so that removed it from my staging. Now I'm going to go over to here. I'm going to delete it from my File Explorer view, delete, and move to recycle bin. Okay, so it is no longer a file in my workspace. And if I go to my Git, oh, look at that. Are these apps? Oh, because I deleted my gitignore, my star.app exclusion is no longer there. So now all these app files are showing up. Okay, so that definitely did the trick. So now let's try Waldo's recommendation. Okay, so let me just close this for visual noise. I'm going to type code.gitignore-a. Did that work? Nope. See, I have two VS Code sessions here. It opened the gitignore in the second one. And so I'll just say star.app and I'm going to save it. And if I close this VS Code, it's still there. So I don't know if it's a bug in my VS Code, my environment, something, a permission thing. I'm not sure. So Waldo says it worked for him. The instructions on the code command say that -r is reuse the same window. For whatever reason, that's not working for me. So if it doesn't work for you, you can use the new-item.gitignore PowerShell version. And that just creates the file. It doesn't attempt to open it in a VS Code tab. Okay. So where were we? We had a gitignore and we have star.app in it. Now, if we go back to our code, we see it is a change. So let's stage that. Git add. Let's see if it is case sensitive. The message. I swear I used to get a message while testing this just a few hours ago, but it is case sensitive. And now I'll do the proper case. It moves my changed file into staged files. Excellent. So how are we doing here? We are ready to commit, I think. Commitment is a scary thing for some, but now we have git commit. And this is where we go from the stage area where we can kind of easily back out to where we're committing that code to our local repo. You can probably undo it. Seems you can undo everything, but git commit -m, and I will say this is my initial commit. Okay, and I'm going to press enter. And so that combined the git commit command with a message, and that would be just as if I typed this message here. And I clicked on the check mark. So we're mimicking the steps that we would have done in the UI. So now that we've committed, that's just our local repo, right? How do we sync our local repo with our remote repository? In this case, I'm going to use Azure DevOps. Well, first, at least in the case of Azure DevOps and most remote repositories that I've used, you have to create some type of workspace. Now, it varies based on whether you're using Bitbucket, GitLab, Azure DevOps, or whatever. In the case of Azure DevOps, I have to create what's called a project. So within my organization, I have to create a project, and then within that project, I can use Git command line to create the remote repository. So here is my empty project. If I click on repos, it is empty. Add some code. Great. So I'm not going to do that via UI in Azure DevOps. You can probably do it 5 different ways. I've been doing it via the UI, but let's do that via command line here. Okay. And so we are going to add, or essentially create, the Git remote while adding that. Let's see. Yeah, it's called Git remote add. So now there is a URL syntax for creating. Let me just open Notepad separately. For creating an Azure DevOps repository. And in this case, it's my organization at devazure.com. And then it is my organization again. And then it is my, not my, yeah, this is my repo. This is the repo name. So I'm going to call this, in this case, Git Command Line, and then it repeats again for some reason. And I'm sure there's an entire PhD degree that you can figure out as to how these various URLs are formatted. And this might vary depending on the Git repository platform you're using. But this is the one for, I believe I need for Azure DevOps. So I'm just going to paste that in here. So I'm going to type the command git remote add, and then I'm going to give it a name. And in this case, I'm going to call it origin because that's apparently like the default. Again, something else to look into, but I'm just going to get through it for now. Then I'm going to paste in my Azure DevOps URL. And I think I'm doing that right. And magically, no error messages. I'm going to go over to Azure DevOps, click on my repos. Oh, I haven't pushed. Okay. Pretend I didn't do that. Okay, so now I've added the pointer to my remote repository here locally. I think that's what I just did. So Azure DevOps doesn't know what's going on yet. I haven't pushed anything to Azure DevOps. So next up is, I just need to look at my titles, right? I did all this work to prepare. Next up is Git push, and this is where we take our local changes and push them up to Azure DevOps. And now at this point, we have configured our Git remote information. And if you ever want to verify what's going on, you can type git remote-v. And that allows you to view where is this repository pointing for its remote. In this case, we see, oh, it is the Git command line remote repo for fetch and push. Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to push. But what if I made a mistake? What if before I pushed, I'm like, I didn't mean to use that remote. You can actually undo it. And so let's remove our Git remote. And so let's do Git, oops, wrong one. I'm doing this a little out of order, but Git remote rm, and then you need to give the name, which in this case was origin. And so it just kind of silently does that. Let's do our Git remote v again. And you'll notice nothing appears. Okay. Now, in prior testing, I was getting slightly different feedback. And so I'm not sure. There's definitely some inconsistencies when working from the terminal in VS Code. I don't know quite what's going on. Today's the first day I've really used it. And in the 4 or 5 hours I've been using it, I've seen some very inconsistent behavior. So I'm sure it's my fault, but if you notice some weird behavior, let me know. So we did git remote v to view what's going on, and we have nothing left. So we have no remote configured. So we can reconfigure and say, oh, I made a mistake. That should have been, git command line 1 or something like that. So you can undo your remote origin. Even after you push, you can undo it and change your remote origin to a different destination. So I tried that as well, and that works. So I've reset my git remote destination to BC Learning Git command line. Now I'm finally ready to push my changes. So to do that, I'm going to, I think I went out of order for my titles, git push -u, and you can't really see this, 1 second. Okay, git push -u origin --all. I'm not a fan of some parameters are dash, some parameters are 2 dashes. And so again, we're doing this just to learn the commands. I'm not a fan of the inconsistencies and all the parameters you need to remember with Git via the command line. I'm sure if you do it for 5 years, you'll know what those are, but it's just one more thing to store in my brain that I don't really have the capacity to. So like I said, I will not be doing this on a daily basis. So I'm going to press enter to push all of my changes that I've committed, plus all of my files and everything, up to the remote repository that I have identified. And this may look familiar to you. You may see some of these types of messages in the UI when you do a sync, as it's called. Yeah, synchronize changes. It essentially performs this step. Now, I think we should finally be able to go over here, click on repos, and there we go. We have essentially, we've created our repo, we have pushed the files in, and now Azure DevOps is aware of our changes. Okay. Now, even after this, I can say, oops, I wanted a different remote. Now, it's a little late. You've kind of committed, but you could still, let me turn screencast off. It's getting in the way. You could still do git remote rm, remove your remote connection, configure a new one, and you can actually select a different repository, Azure Remote, and commit there. So you can do all sorts of crazy things via command line. Probably also do it via the UI, but anyway, lots of options. So now that we have everything in Azure DevOps, we have staged our changes, we've committed our changes, and we have synchronized them via a commit, via a push. What else can we do? Let's try branching. Okay, so this, I call it branching, and in VS Code, if you hover over the branch at the bottom, you'll see master here, and when I click on it, I see my branches. And this is a note. If you do this, if you initialize your repository via Azure DevOps and then you clone to VS Code, your default branch name, in my experience, is main. That's the newer convention. And you'll notice here, because I used Git to initialize my repo, it used a default branch name of master. Now, I am sure you can control that default initial branch name via command line as well. I need to look into how to do that. But that would be one case to not do this via command line unless you know that, because you end up with master and then you have main and people are going to get confused. So anyway, we have a master branch here. I can click on this to create a new branch, check out, or switch branches. So how do I do that via command line? And that is via git checkout. So let's give that a try. So right now it says master is my branch. I'm going to do git checkout -b to create the branch. I don't know what the term is, but we're essentially creating the new branch on the fly. I'm going to call my branch dev, D-E-V. And you'll notice that VS Code changes. It detects the change in branch and it says, I'm now on dev. And you notice we now have master, we now have dev, and we're in the dev branch now. Pretty cool. Well, what if now that I'm in dev, I want to create a new feature branch? Git checkout -b feature 1. Switch to new branch feature 1. And you'll notice master, dev, and feature 1 are all listed here. Okay, so let's see if this works. I'm going to go to, I think I have it, Git graph. Okay, so how do I... Oh, there it is. So I have an extension called Git graph. Let's see what it shows here. Okay, does it have a pretty picture? Okay, so I haven't really made any changes yet, so it's not showing me the pretty picture, but there we have dev, master, and we're in feature 1. Okay, we'll check that out later, see if we can create pretty pictures. That's actually probably going to be a separate one. So now I am in the feature 1 branch. So that's git checkout. Now what if I just want to switch branches? I don't want to create an entirely new branch. Well, to do that, let's just move up here. I can just type git, try it again, git checkout. Let's say I want to go back to dev. Switch to branch dev. So if you remove the -b, it just switches between your branch. So I can do feature 1. Oops, 1. There we go. Dev. And I can just go back and forth all day here. So that's pretty cool. So now let's say that I am in feature 1 and I want to make a change to my file. And so, oops. This is feature 1 code. Going to save that in my file name. And you'll notice that does show up as a change. And now let's stage that. So that was git add filename.al. And there we go. We're staged. And now let's commit that with git commit -m added feature 1. Okay. So now we have committed that change. Now let's see what git graph looks like. Hey, we have a change. Great. Okay. Very exciting. Okay. So now that we have those changes, it is committed. We do need to push to tell Azure DevOps about it. So I'm going to go over to Azure DevOps. I'm just going to refresh, and you'll notice my commits just still has my initial commit. It doesn't know about my feature 1. And also, if I go to my branches, I only have a master branch. It doesn't know about dev. It doesn't know about feature 1 because I haven't done a push. So let's see what happens when we do a git push. Git push -u origin -all. And I didn't test this with multiple branches, so let's see how it behaves. I'm in feature 1 branch, not in dev, and Azure DevOps doesn't know about dev yet. Okay, look at that. New branch dev, new branch feature 1, branch master set up to track remote branch. Okay, so it looks like it pushed up both branches. Let's take a look at that now. I'm going to F5 to refresh. Look at that. So the git push -u origin -all, that sent up all my changes, all my branches, and my new commit. So if I look at my commits, it only shows initial commit. Why is that? It's because up here, I'm looking at the master branch still. If I change to my dev, well, dev, the commit wasn't in dev. My commit was in feature 1. And it says added feature 1. So that's my feature 1 code. So let me go back to my repo here. Okay. And what else do we have? Now, a couple things I've found in the UI of Azure DevOps that I do not like. And let's give this a try. This is kind of off-roading, but it uses the command line and will show you a few things I do not like. One is that an Azure DevOps project can have multiple repos, but I don't like the way that it exposes those. So if I click on repos, like let's take files. If I click on files, I see files, multiple files. I see a list of files. If I click on commits, I see multiple commits. If I click on repos, plural, not repo, repos, I only see one repo, and that is this one, Git Command Line. Okay, at the moment I only have one, but let's try this via command line. Let's create a second repo. So how do we do that? Well, we want to remove our remote connection. And how did we do that? We used git remote rm origin. So let me clear this. Let's take a look at what our remote settings are at the moment. Git remote -v. So currently, this local repo is pointing to a remote repo called Git Command Line. Okay, and I'm going to remove that. So I'm going to say git remote rm origin. So now I'm disconnected from my Azure DevOps as a remote repository, and I'm going to create a new repository, git remote add origin, and I'm going to call this Git Command Line 1. So I'm going to create a separate repository in this project. Yep, I think. Git Command Line. Okay, we'll see what happens. I may be making a mistake. I think this might be my project. Okay, let's see what happens here. So I'm going to be in my Git Command Line project. I'm going to point to a new repo called, remote repo called Git Command Line 1. So I want to have Git Command Line and Git Command Line 1 repos so that I have two repos in the same project. Let's see if this works. So that's just telling my local repo, here's where you're going to point. Okay, so now I'm going to push these changes. Git push -u origin, and I may be getting myself into trouble here, which is a lesson. You can get yourself into trouble via the command line very easily. Okay, the repository does not exist. Add origin. Okay, so how did I do that before? Git remote add origin, remote v, rm origin. Git command line. And I want a new repo. Okay, let's just do a test. I'm going to do a new repo and test. And if I clone that, what is, yeah, if I clone that, the URL is my project name and then my remote repo name. So why won't that work? Maybe it is a permission issue, although I don't think so. So I did git remote -v, and that is Git Command Line 1. And that was done at origin. Git push u. Maybe I need to be back in master. Git push u origin all. Okay. Well, I did this earlier today. It is not working, but I can still demonstrate the issue that I have with, that I don't really like about Azure DevOps. That is, when I click on repos, I don't see repos. I only see repo, and it says test. And I finally realized, oh, you can have multiple repositories. It's not here. It's not here. It's not here. It's up here in the breadcrumb area. I don't really like that. It's like everything else is a list. I can see what's going on. Except for repos, I have to go up here and I have to switch repos. I guess it's similar to branches. I have to know, am I in the wrong branch? Do I need to be in dev? So that's just a I don't know, a minor annoyance that I'm not a fan of. But you can, I now know, have multiple repositories in an Azure DevOps project. Yes. Okay. So now that I've created a fine mess, let me switch back here. Let me fix this. So git remote -v, I'm pointing to something called git command line 1, which doesn't exist. That remote repo doesn't exist. So let me do git remote rm origin, remove that, and let's see if it'll let me add it back. And this is going to be git command line, git command line. Okay, it let me reset that origin. Well, okay, that's just local. Now let's try changing to feature 1, going in, making a change, another update to feature 1. This is an update to feature 1. Okay, now I just made a change. There we go. So now we can say git add star. It's the only change I made, so let's just use that. And let's do, where is it? Git commit -m update to feature 1. Okay, that committed it. Now we need to push. Git push -u origin --all. Okay, I think that worked. Let's now go back into Azure DevOps, and we have to choose our repo, git command line. We have to choose our branch, and that was feature 1 branch. And now we can choose look at our commits, and there we go, update to feature 1. This is an update to feature 1. So that worked. So that is interesting. So now we have all of these changes that we made. We developed in feature 1, which I believe should be a child branch of our dev branch. So now what I want to do, and I haven't tested this yet, living on the edge, I want to merge. So I want to merge my feature 1 branch up to my dev branch. Let's say everything went well and we are happy with those changes. They passed QA. So let's try this. Okay. So we can switch between branches. So I'm going to say git checkout, and I want to move up to the dev branch. Okay. And ta-da, we're doing a git merge. Git checkout dev. So we're in the dev branch. Sorry, I entertain myself with these things. And now we want to merge feature 1. So how do we do that? Git merge feature 1. So git merge can be a little intuitive. You don't merge from feature 1 up to dev. You first have to switch to dev, and then you merge feature 1 into it. So it's saying, I am in dev. I want to merge feature 1 into my current branch. Now, technically, I think you could probably define a from and to, but this, I think, is the standard convention. In Visual Studio, full Visual Studio, the UI does allow you to choose merge from into, or you want to be in this branch and you want to merge which branch into it. You can define both parameters. So I'm just going to keep it simple. Git merge feature 1. Updating, fast forward, and okay, so we did a merge, and now that I've done that merge, I want to push my changes. Git push -u origin all. Okay, so now if we go back up to Azure DevOps, we can look at our commits. Now our feature 1 already had those commits. Let's see what dev has. Look at that. Dev now has our feature 1 changes and updates. Okay. And yeah, I think that was the last one. So that was a messy walkthrough, I apologize, of ways that, or how to use Git via command line to perform the same operations that you can normally do very easily via the UI. And I learned a few things. It's like, okay, initialize. Some of these commands are the same in the UI. They have the same names as they do when you issue the Git command, but some of them are different. So in VS Code, when I hover over this little circle thing at the bottom, it says synchronize changes. Okay, well, behind the scenes, it's really doing a Git push, I believe. So if I were to go on a Git forum and ask a Git question and say, well, I did a Git synchronized, they would probably say, what are you talking about? Do you mean a Git push? And they'd have to kind of guess because I'm doing a Git synchronize in VS Code. Well, really, I want to be able to know, when I click this little circly doodad, it's doing a Git push origin all, presumably. Okay? And how do I change the remote? Or if I'm setting my connection to Azure DevOps, that is a Git remote. So it's good, I think, to know these things. And here, I'm just clicking a different branch. But really what's going on behind the scenes when I change branches is a Git checkout. So I think it's good to know what those commands are that are being issued in the background. Now, having done this, do I want to use Git command line? No. I'm happy to use the UI going forward, but it is good to see, and it actually helped me see a little bit how Azure DevOps works. So not only can you see the changes that are occurring in your source control page here, or source control tab in VS Code, but you can also see the changes that are occurring in Azure DevOps. So with that was a lot. Let's recap here. Okay, so we have a Git command recap. And we did a git init that initialized our local repository. We did a git add, which staged our files, staged our changes. Git reset will roll back those changes. And you can also do a git rm -- cached, but I'm less a fan of that because it's easier to screw up. So you can either use the UI to selectively unstage something, or you can just unstage everything and then restage everything. We created a gitignore file via command line. You can do that using the code command, but that in my case popped open a new window. Apparently other people, it works just fine. But you can also use just the new item PowerShell command. We did git add filename, and that allows you to just stage one file. And then you can view your changes. I prefer to do that via VS Code by clicking on the file and see the changes that were made using a diff. These are a little out of order, it looks like. Git rm -- cache, that's the one you could do to pull out one file if you want from stage changes. Git status, that's where you can see what the status of all your files are. Are they changed? Are they committed? Are they staged? Git commit pushes them to commit with a message. Add git remote tells your local repository, where should I push this to the remote repo? Then you do a git push to send them up. And yep, that's pushing them up to your remote repo. You can remove your git remote. You can re-add a new git remote. And in my prior testing, I was able to create a new remote repository. So that didn't work today, but it is possible. I have done it in testing. I just did something wrong or out of order. And then Git checkout allows you to create or change branches on your local repo. And after you do that, you do need to do a Git push in order to tell your Git checkout does things locally. A Git push will tell your remote repo about those changes. And then finally, Git merge. Once you're done with, say, your feature 1 branch, you can merge that up to your dev branch, for instance, and then again, you'll do a Git push to tell your remote repo that those changes have occurred. So that was a dizzying array of commands, and that is probably why, further evidence as to why I shall not be doing this via command line often. But it was a good exercise to kind of play with these. So I recommend it. I recommend creating just a new Visual Studio Code, a new AL project. Just set up a dummy project in Azure DevOps with no repositories, a test project, and then create these local and remote repos, make some changes, do a git add, do a git commit, do git push, and then change branches and see how this behaves in both VS Code and in Azure DevOps. I think it's a good exercise, and I'll probably need to do it 3 or 4 more times just to get the hang of all the steps and what sequence I want to do things. Because I found that if I do things and I miss a step, it's kind of a hassle to go back and fix that mistake. So for example, gitignore. If you go through all of the steps, you commit your changes, and then you do a push, all of your files will be in Azure DevOps. Well, what if I didn't want my app files to be in Azure DevOps? It's kind of too late. It's already pushed to the remote repo. It's committed in Git. Technically, there's probably a way to remove those files from the remote repo, but it's really messy. And one example of where that becomes very important is if you have, say, API encryption keys, and those are on the local file system, those accidentally got into your local repo because they weren't yet excluded by gitignore. Once those get pushed to your remote repo, you could have API keys stored in your Git repo. And that's just a bad practice. So you'll want to delete the repo or figure out how to remove them from your remote repo. And so that's where the sequencing becomes very important. Okay, enough. How long has this taken? An hour. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But with that, what's next? That is it. So I hope that crazy, eclectic, scattered journey was of some value and you learned some things to try. But give it a try and get more comfortable with Git. This helped me make Git less intimidating to me. And with that, have a good one.